Greetings, class. In this segment, we're going to talk about workplace conflict. And the question is, how should workplace conflict be managed? And so there's two different features of the segment. One is to say that there are fundamentally three different categories of conflicts that I'm going to say take place at workplaces. There's your client or customer that may or may not be involved in a dispute. I'll say the worker that may or may not be involved in the dispute, and the management that may or may not be involved in this dispute. And so the conflicts you may engage with change if it's worker to worker, customer to customer, or manager to manager. And that a large part of what we're going to talk about is actually going to be imagining relationships between employees and not customers or clients. But frequently those kinds of conflicts are a significant one because it tells the rest of the workplace what will or won't happen or what will or will not be tolerated. But also that's probably the first thing that good management policy would do is set up kind of the protocol or procedure for what to do, how to handle conflicts between customers or clients. And so on that part, I'm going to say that the dynamic that I want to highlight is called front-end loading. It's the idea that we put a lot of work up front, and this would be like the training, the customer relations, whatever would be part of the training, that everybody might get the hour or hours of how to handle conflicts in their training at an organization. And that's done with the anticipation that hopefully the employee never has to manage the conflict or whatever it might be. But you load it up front, let people know that we have policies and procedures in place. And that's the second part. Certain types of conflicts need to be managed by certain types of individuals. Those certain individuals should really receive more expert training. If you're not the person who has been trained to do this, and somebody who has been, you would probably engage with that conflict by getting the person who's tasked to address it. Conversely, you might be at a workplace or experiencing a conflict that has not been anticipated. And the absence of the clear protocol or procedure would then be mapped, I think, best according to whatever other conflict skills and training you have received, as well as your own calculus about what the kind of cost return analysis would be. Frequently, it's important to remind people, it's important for me to remember for myself, that trying to engage in a conflict may help people reach agreement, but it may also blow up in my face. Sometimes getting involved is a mistake, and having a serious appraisal about what is going to happen is always something that you should do. And when it comes to conflicts, it could be a physical altercation, it could be a shouting match, it could be any number of types of things, and different behaviors can help us to either escalate or de-escalate that situation. When people are getting physically violent, for example, if you don't have training on managing that, if you feel a threat to your physical safety, again, whenever you feel threatened by the conflict, no matter what else I may have said about engaging in conflict or being strategic about it, I caution people to avoid conflicts that they feel would be threatening or compromising to them in any way, especially when it can be avoided. Letting the people who are tasked to manage threats and violence is, smart thinking. So now to the other part where there is kind of three different kind of academic views on workplace conflict, if you will. The first one we'll call kind of the traditional view. And in the traditional view of conflict, it's kind of seen that any conflict in the workplace will hamper performance, cause, increased tensions, decrease morale, and should always be avoided. And so if you've identified that you're in a workplace that holds to this kind of traditional view, the first thing you should have about your strategic mechanism is that you are also going to accept that that's the rules of kind of the culture that you're in, that workplace. You might feel differently about your ability to manage conflict, produce positive outcomes, see conflict as an opportunity. But if the system has been designed and the system has been created, usually the best advice I can give about engaging with that is to follow the rules that have already been established. That is to say, this is recommendations for working in that environment as opposed to creating that environment. If you want to be strategic about establishing the mechanism for conflict management at your workplace because you are going to be the business owner or you're going to be management, again, there might be reasons to strategically think that that would be a good way to engage it. I talk about conflict being an opportunity, but there are different cases where conflict or the presentation of conflict can be disruptive. One of those might be in particularly high turnover businesses. I have worked in different places where because people come and go pretty regularly, maybe they have short-term assignments and so forth, the idea that people would learn how to manage conflicts together does take time. And if you are less likely to have employees get to the part where they know how to communicate and use conflict in a productive manner, you'd have short-term loss for long-term gain. But because there's no long-term in that kind of relationship, it may be a bad strategic decision. There's a human relations kind of strategy for approaching conflict, which is an approach that, conflicts do occur. They occur naturally, and it cannot be avoided, right? Like, we know that when people work together, sometimes they will agree, sometimes they'll disagree. And so if we can't remove conflict from the workplace, then we need to set up people who will be tasked with that feature, right? So you'd hire human relations employees who would then become the neutral third party or mediator or whatever, the people that would handle that. Again, so when I talked about the front end loading earlier, that was assuming that all people would be trained to be able to respond to something. In this version of the front end loading, it's the idea that conflicts will be a reality in a workplace. And so instead of making everybody get, 40 hours of mediation training, we'll make sure that we have 2 employees that get, bring in like decades of workplace mediation experience. And that we want to make sure that we have a workforce where people are not afraid to bring their disputes to the experts who will then, diplomatically problem solve. Like, what's the dispute? How can we manage this? How can we make this work? And in order for human relations workplaces to be really effective, steps have to be taken. They have to be taken early on to show that there's no stigma, right? That people who choose to use the dispute resolution or the mediation services or whatever the services that are being offered are not treated pejoratively from having used them. Incentivize it. Have people who are trained to do that job and do it effectively. People go in, they leave and they're better off for it, right? Because the conflict becomes an opportunity. So having human relations where there are actually effective resolutions produced that increase, output and productivity in the workplace, that's great. Avoid the part where, for example, the human relations department would be overwhelmed. So then they're refusing some people, or they're not able to give the energy that they need for the certain conflicts. Frequently, human relations offices are tasked with doing other things as well, like payroll and so forth. So that creates a tension, a conflict of interest sometimes, that dealing with the disputes is actually not prioritized over other details. And so that's a predictable conflict that can be managed or planned for. And if it's not, then it could create a human relations team that's not able to accomplish all of the things that are desired. The last view is the kind of interactionist approach to conflict in the workplace. And this is probably for a workplace model where you really want to keep people around for a long time. The team is being established with the goal of having a really long working relationship. But the idea is just that the more that you engage with the conflicts, resolve and settle the disputes, the more you really strengthen relationships and increase kind of the number and the strength of the interactions between people. This might move away from a human resources team kind of managing disputes between others to more kind of focused leadership models where group leaders are able to work directly with the individuals, maybe more the tight-knit bunch, but also that the group to group dynamics would be managed in kind of a stronger relational way. And the craziest part here is that this model actually is the idea that you should maintain, kind of have an even flow of conflict. That because conflict is natural, I might even say this would be like the therapeutic model, except for therapy is a completely different function than what's happening in the workplace. But the idea is that because you're treating conflict as something that's not just expected and unavoidable, but good, you are actually encouraging people to engage and showcase the conflicts and tensions that are emerging as they emerge, and maybe even resolving them in real time as a good thing. And the biggest benefit of this from my professional standpoint would be that we have a tendency in conflict that when issues are left unresolved, they can fester. What felt like it was an act of being disrespected, when collected with other acts that made you feel disrespected, can create an overarching feeling between coworkers of disrespect that if the person had just let the other person know immediately, at the first kind of behavior, hey, when you do such and such, makes me feel disrespected, that person might have the opportunity to say, oh, I didn't mean anything by it. Now that I know that bothers you, I promise that won't happen again. But that's much different a process once this has gone on for several weeks, where the weight of all of maybe the supposed crimes, if you will, against the other individual who's feeling the disrespect now has a different feeling, a different mood about that relationship. And a person apologizing, even if they make 100 individual apologies for all of the different fractional slights, will not have the same impact in healing that relationship. Right? Because it might have grown from feeling disrespected to actually feeling distrust. And if you lose trust for someone, right? Again, if these kind of infractions abscess, right? If the infection gets worse, then it actually becomes harder to treat. In some cases, when we ignore conflicts, they will go away, right? Small infractions, right? It takes energy to be angry at somebody, to store that. But once we've done our job of storing the infractions, they kind of transform into something different and worse. So, 3 different models: traditional, all conflict should be avoided; interactionist, all conflict should be embraced; and human relations model is we're going to have specific people to set up to deal with disputes between coworkers. Hopefully that gives you an overview of kind of what you can think about or expect in workplaces, and the things to look for when you're in a new workplace so that you could figure out what kind of team you're on. See you on the next one.